Hello, Dan Alasso here with History for Today. And today, once again, I want to talk about the history of note-taking, and especially the history of Niklas Luhmann's Zettelkasten. Now, I have found another thing to read, and I have just read it and processed it. So I'm going to talk about the content of what I read and also about the process of taking my notes on it and getting them into my system. So the thing that I found was a relatively new book called Raw Data is an Oxymoron, which is a series of essays edited by Lisa Gittelman, MIT Press, 2013. And the sixth chapter is called Paper as Passion, Niklas Luhmann and His Card Index by Markus Krajewski. And in the contributors list, it says that Markus Krajewski is an associate professor of media history and science at the Faculty of Media at Bauhaus University, Weimar. And he has published several things about cards and card catalogs. He is also the developer of an app called Synapsen that you can see at verzetteln.de. So, what did I find out? Well, first of all, how did I do this? I took this book, which I got on interlibrary loan from the library. I got my trusty scanner out and I scanned it and I turned it into a bunch of PDF pages. And then I brought them into Adobe Acrobat Pro and stitched them together into a single document. And then I ran Adobe's OCR process on it so that the text can actually be recognized by software. And once I did that, I put it into Margin Note 3 and I sat down with my iPad and my trusty pencil and highlighted it and made notes to my heart's content. And then once I had done that, that was the first step, was reading it and highlighting it and making a few notes, which actually is really cool. In Margin Note 3 on the iPad, you can handwrite your notes and it will turn your scribbling into text so that then you can bring it into your documents. So once I had done that, I moved things around and went through the highlights again and put them in an order that was based on my own interest in what I had highlighted, not specifically where it occurred in the text. So basically, the first thing that you get when you do this in Margin Note 3 is you get a box with a bunch of little things that look like Post-it notes, and they're basically just in the order that you highlighted them, in the order that they appear in the text. Now, the text, as I have said, and as this article actually describes really interestingly, is a one-dimensional walk through a forest of data. So although I'm interested in what the author has to say, I don't necessarily only care about the way that the author has organized it for the purposes of this particular essay. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. But let me tell you what Markus Krajewski said, because I think that will shed some light on what I'm talking about here. So in Paper as Passion, Krajewski begins by talking a little bit about Hegel, who apparently also had a slip box back in the 18th century. I'm not that particularly interested in Hegel himself or in his slip box, so I'm going to pass by that. Krajewski does say that writing and excerpting form the basis of everyday note-taking. And then he quotes Luhmann. And one of the reasons that I searched for this text is that Krajewski quotes Luhmann from a variety of different sources. So now I don't necessarily have to go and find all of those sources. He quotes Luhmann as saying, "When I read a book, I do it in the following way. I always have a note card on hand on which I note the ideas of certain pages. On the backside, I record the bibliographical information. When I have read through the book, then I go through these notes and I consider what could be useful for notes that have already been written. Thus, I always read with an idea toward the notability of books." By which I think he means the usefulness of the content in the books to his own research and his own set of interests. And this is a really great description by Luhmann himself of his method, I think. So Krajewski then goes on to quote a passage from the interview in Archimedes und Wir. In this passage, the interviewer is saying to Luhmann that the Zettelkasten is really the basis, so to speak, of your work. And Luhmann says, yes. And the interviewer says, without which, if one were to take that from you, then it would be difficult. And Luhmann says, yes, it would be very difficult. Krajewski also addresses the arbitrary nature of the numbering system on the card and says that Luhmann has created a concrete address for each card, which may thus not be rearranged into a thematically centered system or an alphabetical catalog. And this is very deliberate and very important as part of the process. And I think Krajewski believes that it leads to the results that Luhmann got. As an effect of this internal branching capability, Krajewski says, individual clusters of terms form, which assume central importance for the theory. And then Krajewski adds in parentheses, and vice versa. From given input, the slip box produces combinatorial possibilities which had never been planned, intended, or conceived of as such, says Luhmann. And this has been quoted all over the place because this is part of the bigger than the sum of its parts emergent aspect of the Zettelkasten system that we're all hoping to experience. The slip box, Luhmann does say, though, costs me more time than writing books. And we've heard this before in other sources. There is an interesting footnote in this document, which also comes from Archimedes und Wir, where Luhmann says, if I have nothing else to do, then I write the whole day. In the mornings from 8:30 a.m. until midday. Then I briefly go walking with my dog. And then I have time again in the afternoon from 2 p.m. until 4 p.m. Then it's the dog's turn again. Yes, then I write again in the evenings, as a rule, until around 11 p.m. At 11 p.m., I mostly lie in bed and read a few more things. And the context of this, if I recall from the interview, which I read in German, so I may have been getting parts of it slightly wrong, but I think the gist was that he had just explained to the interviewer that he's an old man now, his wife has died, his children are all grown up, so all he has to do is spend his time on his studies. Krajewski goes on to talk about the slipbox becoming a combination machine, which not only answers the questions asked of it with some remembered readings, but also offers a list of connections that the user may not have remembered and may not anticipate. He quotes Luhmann as saying, each note is just an element which first gains its quality from the network of references and cross-references in the system. So Krajewski describes this as a social system formed from the slipbox as a notation system and the I as what he calls the read-write head. So he's going with Luhmann's metaphor of this interaction, this communication. But really, if the I is the read-write head, then this whole system is really a single machine. And it is a machine that, Krajewski says, can help its users to entirely unforeseen insights. He calls it a second memory system, and he says that it gains a certain independence when it intervenes in the stream of thought of the reasoning other, that's the I. And he begins to call it an independently thinking slipbox. And this sort of implies a theory of thought, I think, in which thinking is mostly about making connections. I don't have too much of a problem with that. It does create a situation, though, where Krajewski says, partially because of the brevity of Luhmann's notes, many of them are incomprehensible to others. So this is a very personal and private communication between the owner of the slipbox and the slipbox itself. Krajewski says that ideas develop during speech, during this interaction between the self and the other. So he's talking about a systems theory that he's trying to make encompass this interaction in the slipbox. Through the interplay with this interface, he says, which makes the silent other talk. Krajewski then interestingly says that the book, and I'm quoting him here, the book is an archaic intermediate between two different card index systems. For everything substantial is found in the slipbox of the researcher who wrote it and the scholar who studies it, assimilated into its own card index. So Krajewski's idea here is that the author has a slipbox, a forest of ideas, and so does the reader, right? And that the book is this two-dimensional product, this two-dimensional walk through the forest that the author does, that then the reader takes and expands back up, blows back up again into a three-dimensional output, right? And I guess that is the process that I am doing here. It's interesting. It's very interesting to me, though, that both of these slip boxes are multidimensional, and the book that stands between them is one-dimensional. And we could think of this as a good thing or a bad thing or just the way things are right now, but it does kind of lead to interesting speculations about what might come after this, if we can move on from this one-dimensional communication between these two very complex multidimensional systems. Krajewski says that one of the basic philological precepts states that the text knows more than the author. But when we think of text as just one-dimensional paths through this forest of ideas in the slipbox, is that still accurate? Or are we actually trying to get at the something that's hidden behind the text? Krajewski then goes on to say it's the courage of jumping in at a promising point that sets the inquiring reader on the path to a referential journey. The surprise of stumbling upon an aspect not previously considered thanks to a reference, and then the coincidence of this hint appearing precisely there and not elsewhere. So coincidence and contingency are really interesting elements of this whole process. And then Krajewski finally concludes by talking about how does one succeed in endowing the slipbox with this ability for surprise, supported by an indispensable abundance of information. And he answers his question by saying, in a word, time, with which the complex structures will develop without outside assistance. These will arise so long as it is guaranteed that the user injects information in the form of small textual building blocks, facts, thought fragments, longer excerpts, all the way to completely predetermined lines of reasoning with sufficient persistence. And moreover, that these be tied into the existing referential structure. So apparently the moral of the story is that I should just put everything that I find in, and I should comment on it, and I should spend time making sure that I link it to other stuff so that I can start to create these webs of knowledge. And apparently that is the system that Luhmann used. And apparently he did spend more time tending to this garden than actually writing the 500 articles and the 50 books that he published during his career. So that was an interesting read for me. I was also pretty pleased with the way that scanning the document, bringing it into margin note and highlighting it, then arranging my highlights, and then actually I was able to get an outline of those and put them into Obsidian and then use that as the basis of what I have just said to you. So I hope people found that interesting. I was certainly interested in both the content and the process. So stay tuned for more, and thanks for listening. I will see you again next time.